I'll start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Audit Standards Committee meeting dated the 4th of July 2022. Agenda item number 1, apologies for absence.
Yes, Chairman, apologies from Councillors Rachel Lilly, Hilary Bruce, Diego Rodriguez and Mr Julian Taylor.
Thank you. Is there any urgent business?
Nick Bailey says that he emailed Andrew with his apology.
And Councillor Bayless.
Is there any urgent business? No. Public speaking time? No. Declarations of interest, members? On to agenda item number 5, members' code of conduct. Over to you, Mrs. Wellman.
Thank you very much. Now, you might have thought that being one item on the agenda, you're going to be out the door within about 10 minutes.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm going to disappoint you because I've got a 69 slide presentation here, but don't panic because the presentation is from the LGA, so they have devised this for the model code. I've adapted it obviously to fit our scenario. I've cut it down from the 91 slides that they had to 69. But what we'll do is we will pace through it. But if I'm going too quickly or too slowly, please tell me. And if you just want to do it differently, just please do say. But I think it's really important when you're considering whether to recommend the new code to the council that you yourselves really understand it. And also you'll see the sort of training that I'm going to be proposing to give to our members if we go ahead and adopt that code. So first slide, please, Steve. Thank you. So the background is, if you remember, we when the model code came out, we set up a working group as a committee to have a look at that code, and we had a really positive meeting at the beginning of last year. When I think we were moving towards a direction of wanting to recommend the code. But everything then went in abeyance while we were awaiting the outcome of local government reorganisation, and also so that we could try and get all of the councils in Somerset in the same direction. So we managed to do that, but the focus had to move into the code for the new authority for Somerset Council as from May. So the focus went on adapting the model code for that council. So Somerset County Council adopted that in the first quarter. We also reached an agreement with SELC that they would also support adoption of that code. So a letter went to all the towns and parishes in April recommending that they also adopt the code. And all 4 districts in Somerset are going to be recommending adoption of this code to their councils by September. Next slide, please. So really the purpose of today is just to outline a little bit more for you in terms of the code of conduct, and really just to enable you to make an informed decision about adopting that code. So as I say, we will shoot through some of these slides. As I've already said, the LGA has prepared this presentation for use by all councils, so all I've done is adapted it to suit our own circumstances. Next slide. So very importantly, when we looked at the LGA model code, we felt that there were a few things missing. So in there, you will see some suggested changes, and I'm just going to run through those. So the first one is that it made no mention of the fact that if a member was involved in a decision, so primarily your executive members, that they then shouldn't be part of the scrutinising of that decision. So that's gone into the draft. At the moment in our existing code, there is an obligation on members to consider any advice of Section 151 and myself as monitoring officer. That's been in the code the whole time I've been here at Sedgemoor for I think 20 years. So that's always been there, but for some reason they didn't put it into the model code. So we're recommending that you include that. But of course, it's always really important for me to emphasise that only means considering our advice. It doesn't mean you have to follow it. So it's really important to emphasise that. There was also no clarity in relation to the obligation not to intimidate, that would include complainants and witnesses in any code of conduct complaint. And that's obviously clearly important because I very often have a situation where a complaint comes in, member immediately having been notified that there's a complaint about them, gets on the phone to the complainant, potentially that's intimidating witnesses. So it's really important that members are aware that that could trigger that. So I think that's important to go in the code. There's an obligation in the new code, which you don't have in your current code, which is to declare gifts that you refuse. Now, officers have had that in our code of conduct for many years, and the auditors have so many times asked us to put it in the member code. But because our code was based on the one that was in place before 2012 and was set by the government, we could always argue, well, the government wrote this code, there's no need to put that paragraph in there. But I think times have moved on. If some members are being regularly encouraged to try and accept gifts, that obviously shows some sort of pattern going on there. So it's really important that we do put an obligation, I feel anyway, on members to declare anything that has been refused. In the model code, they said anything significant. Well, what does significant mean? That could be of any value. So we've simply put it at £50, which is at the same level of gifts that you have to declare that you've accepted. So, slide. Stupidly, there was no obligation in the code to update your interests within 28 days of any change. And that's obviously something that's in the Localism Act, so you're legally required to do it, but the code didn't reflect that. So we want to put that in there. You will remember, or you may remember, that in the current code that you work to, that as a member of a dual-hatted member, that never gives rise to a prejudicial interest, only a personal interest. So it enables you to still take part, because it's always perceived, if you're on two public bodies, you're always acting in the interest of those public bodies. So it was felt that there was no reason why you couldn't take part in a decision affecting the other public body that you're on. So we've mirrored that in this new code, but we've also applied it to membership of local authority companies. So our members who are on homes in Sedgemoor at the moment generally only declare a personal interest only, and it's just to make sure that they're completely covered in doing that, because clearly they've only been appointed onto that company because of Sedgemoor and to act in Sedgemoor's best interest. And finally, we've put a new appendix into the code covering bias and predetermination. That was in our old code, so we thought it made sense to cover that, even though it's not technically a code issue. At least people can read what it's about and understand it. So those are the only changes that we are proposing to the model code, and that all of the councils in Somerset are proposing those same changes. Same with towns and parishes, although there's some slight tweaks, because, for example, scrutiny clearly doesn't apply to towns and parishes, so there are some slight differences, but basically it's the same code. Okay, next slide, please. So I won't read out, that's a quote from the Committee on Standards in Public Life, and as you know, they've done quite a lot of work over the last few years, and they were very keen that there was a lot of changes introduced in standards. Unfortunately, they wanted some legislative changes to ensure that members could be disqualified or suspended if there were serious breaches of code, but the government has said that as far as they're concerned, that's what the ballot box is for, so they're not prepared to make any changes at this point. So that came out a couple of months ago. So the Committee on Standards in Public Life has only got so far. They've got a new model code with a strengthening of it, but they've not got the legislative changes that they were looking for. Okay, I'll gloss over that one. So next slide. Okay, so as you know what the purpose of the code is, but I think that the important one to emphasise is it's about protecting you, the public, and the reputation of the council. I do think sometimes some members, a very small few, but some members forget about that reputation of the council generally. So I think that's what's really important, that everybody has an understanding of what members have to abide by. But also what's important in this new code is it also covers, even though it's not binding, it also covers what the public need to do in terms of giving you respect as well, which I think, in light of some of the problems in society lately, I think that's also really, really important. Slides. Right, I'm not going to go through the general principles under the code because you all know what they are. Yeah, you know the principles, so I think all of us know about those. So I'm going to go on to the general principles that you would be required to abide by under this code. Most of them we'll be able to skirt over because they're already in the existing code that we have. So acting with integrity and honesty, that's not in the current code, but from my point of view, I think that's a good thing to be in there. Acting lawfully, treating everyone fairly and with respect, so we've got that already. Leading by example and acting in a way that secures public confidence in the role of the councillor. So they've obviously beefed up some of the provisions really just to strengthen it a little bit. Next slide, thank you. Impartially exercising responsibilities in the interests of the local community, not seeking to confer an advantage or disadvantage, avoiding conflicts of interest, exercising reasonable care and diligence, and ensuring that public resources are used prudently. So all the things that you do already, but it's just been expanded on a little bit more and a little bit more comprehensive. So in terms of when the code applies, it's still exactly the same. So it will apply in your role as a member, but also if you give the impression that you're acting as a member. And the example we always give of that is if you say in the taxi, don't worry, I'll get your licensing application sorted for you, your taxi license sorted. That would be using your correct position or giving the impression that you're acting as a member. Okay, next one. As you know, code applies to face-to-face meetings, online or telephone meetings, written, verbal, and very importantly, on social media. And that's where this code has a major benefit because our current code does not cover social media. And I get so many complaints about social media, as you can imagine. Skip over a couple of slides. So they give some examples from the code about the difference between when you're acting in your private life and when you're acting in your member life. And that's where a lot of members of the public get really stuck on this. And a lot of members of the public want to make complaints about members when they're in their private life. So that's another thing that I get a lot. So obviously, if you're having an argument with your neighbour, that's in your private life and that's not covered by the code of conduct. If a councillor and an officer were having a personal relationship, that would be covered by the code. This is all from the guidance that the LGA have issued. If you're writing on council note paper or using its email address or business cards or wearing regalia, that you'd be covered by the code at that point. If you had an argument with a taxi driver and threatened their licence, you would be covered by the code for the reason I just gave, that you're giving the impression that you're acting as a councillor at that point. So as I've said, social media is now explicitly covered. And there is also some further advice available from the LGA on dealing with social media. So it'll be helpful for us to roll that out to members as well as, if we do adopt this code. So examples, calling yourself a councillor or not doing so is not conclusive. So basically, when you're on social media, you've got to be really careful as you're clear as to in what capacity you're writing a message. And even if you have not said you're writing as a councillor, you could still be deemed to be writing as a councillor. For example, if you wrote something about a council meeting you attended, it would be quite obvious that you were writing as a councillor, even if you've just used your personal name. There needs to be a link within the posting or the thread to your role as a councillor, basically. So for you to be bound by the code of conduct. If a councillor posted on Facebook that an officer should be sacked, then clearly that would be covered by the code. So it's always really important thinking about what you write in social media. Whereas a councillor making insulting remarks about the Prime Minister, that wouldn't be covered by the code. The Prime Minister would not like it, but it wouldn't be covered by the code. Okay, next slide. So the standards of contact, so they've basically broken it down into 4 areas. So the first is about treating others with respect. We know all about that, but it goes a little bit further about treating employees and representatives of partner organisations and volunteers with respect. So they've just padded that out a little bit. But it's all things that we know to do anyway. highly critical comments and offensive captions that are posted about a councillor who had recently died was an example of disrespect that they've quoted in the guidance. Comments on a blog about nepotism in the award of contracts was also found to be disrespect in the code and also disrepute. And where a councillor made abusive and insulting and personal remarks to a police officer, as in his capacity as a ward member, that was also found to be disrespectful. So just some examples of where they found them to be breaches. So we then move on to the sort of second examples of conduct, which are bullying, harassment, and discrimination. So we've already got bullying and we've already got complying with the qualities in our code of conduct. The only new one is harassment. So they padded it out to include harassment, which I think is really important, because clearly when members get bombarded or with things, correspondence from other members, you know, that can definitely be, you know, amount to harassment. And I'm sure, you know, some of you have had that with members of the public as well, where, you know, it crosses that line. Slide. So some examples that they've given in the guidance about bullying and harassment is bullying is usually not an isolated incident, it's usually a pattern of behaviour. In terms of harassment, they will look at what a reasonable person would consider to be harassment and the impact that it's had on the victim, you know, how they felt about that, the behaviour. And then the other example is about a member who's made unwarranted and inappropriate physical contact with councillors, which I think is something that's in the press at the moment in terms of something going on in central government, and that was deemed to be a breach of the code of conduct. So those are the sorts of things that might constitute bullying and harassment. Some further examples, a councillor liked racially discriminatory comments on social media, so be really careful about that, because I've seen that before where people accidentally just click like on something and actually it's something that's got a comment in the middle. You may not have even read it all and it's got a comment in the middle that is discriminatory. Just because you liked it, they feel that that could amount to a breach of the code. And also, obviously, if a councillor made a derogatory racist comment about a candidate for a job, that would clearly be a breach of the code. The next sort of section is compromising the impartiality of officers. Again, that's something that we've got here, so I don't think we need to dwell on that one. It gives a couple of examples about, you know, sending discourteous correspondence to officers when they're perhaps making a decision, trying to influence a decision, which clearly wouldn't be appropriate. And then a member who tried to influence the decision of the council when dealing with a complaint by his son. Clearly that wouldn't be a council, so both would be breached of the code. Okay, next one again, we've got that. It totally mirrors what we've got in our current code, which is obviously about maintaining confidentiality, something that you regularly have to do. So I don't think we need to dwell on that slide. So it's about not improperly using knowledge gains as a result of your role and not preventing the lawful access to information as well. So it's the other side. If we had an FOI request and you were told that you needed to release some information that was council information, then you know, you can't lawfully prevent that access. Otherwise, that would be a breach of the code as well. Am I going at the right speed? I want to gauge it.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Scoop over speed to example 5. So not bringing the council into disrepute, again, we've got that, and that is a common code of conduct complaint that we have. And some of the examples that they've given, councillors posting offensive tweets about another councillor, that was bringing the authority into disrepute. A councillor took advantage of a mistake and failed to prevent the local authority carrying out work on his privately occupied home. So I'm assuming they were meant to be doing it perhaps on the council houses or something, or council properties, but he forgot to tell them that his wasn't the council property and they carried on and did it to his privately owned home. That clearly would be bringing into disrepute. And the chair of a council making an inappropriate remark at a meeting as well, that would be disrepute. So those are some examples. Next set of examples are using your position to your advantage or the disadvantage of someone else. Again, that's absolutely covered by our current code, so you're very familiar with that. And a couple of examples they've given is voting on a new lease to a community group without revealing that she was actually a member of that group, or a leader failing to declare an interest and using his position to enhance the value of his own land. So clearly, breaching the code. The next examples are not misusing local authority resources. So again, we've got that in the current code. It just goes a little bit further to say that you'll use them in accordance with the local authority's requirements and won't use them for political purposes. So that's all committed to you. You know the examples on that is using the computer, for pornographic images, or using council note paper to, in this case, using council note paper to avoid parking penalties for his son. That's classic. That would be a breach of the code. And actually, this individual, it was a conviction for deception as well. Some new ones, which I personally feel are very, very useful. I'll wait to hear whether you agree or not, but an obligation to undertake standards training. And I would say I think it's useful, of course, but I do often find that those members who end up being in breach of the code have not had their training. So I do think it's really important. An obligation to cooperate with any standards investigation. So we've not had that previously, and we do get members who don't cooperate with standards investigations. Of course, if they still wouldn't cooperate, there would be nothing that we could do about it other than it would be another code of conduct complaint. But, it's an attempt to get people to cooperate. Not intimidating anyone involved in the administration of the investigation of a complaint. We've got that already. And also that you comply with any sanction imposed following a breach finding. So again, that's a new one. So if you are found in breach of the code, it's saying that you should comply with any sanction. Again, I personally can absolutely see why that is in there, but I can also understand that there would be mixed views on that, particularly from a member that didn't like the sanctions that had been imposed upon them and didn't agree with them. So, okay. So we'll then move on to interest. So if anybody's got any query on those general obligations before we move on to interest? I think they're all pretty straightforward, aren't they? At the end of the day, it's not departing too much, and they're straightforward to understand, which is really good. So the next part, which is about declaring interest, is where the change in terminology is. So that's where we need to dwell a little bit more, but not for too long. So gifts and hospitality, obligation now to not accept gifts and hospitality, which of any value, which would give rise to gain or concern. So I suppose that's when somebody's offering you something that really would, if the press got hold of it, look very, very bad. So they're saying, irrespective of the value in those circumstances, if it would be something that would be, totally unacceptable, you shouldn't accept it. But I think we do that anyway, and that's covered in our guidance, about thinking about how would the press perceive something. If you receive a gift, then you need to register it if it's £50 or more. At the moment, we have £25 in our code, so that is putting the threshold up. And I know that mirrors a lot of organisations now at £50. And as I've said, we've made the change so that you also declare any gifts and hospitality that you refuse, but we've put that threshold at £50 rather than the word significant that they were suggesting in the code. Scooting over now to interest, and Steve, thanks for keeping up with me. So we now, as you know, we now have DPIs, we have personal, and we have prejudicial. So under this new code, there would be DPIs, other registrable interests, and non-registerable interest. So I think that's going to be the hardest bit about this code, is just everybody remembering this terminology, which is not a problem, because that will be for us to, assist with that. But I think that's as far as it goes, because actually when we get down to what they mean, you'll find that it's really not very different at all. Okay, so the DPIs, no change there. As you all know, they relate to your employment, interest in land, contracts with the council, that type of thing, any shareholdings over £25,000. And they also apply to your spouse and your partner. So absolutely no change there. And as you know, those are the interests where you can't stay in the room if you've got one. You have to leave the room and not take part in the discussion. Okay, moving on. So that's basically saying that you must disclose it and you mustn't participate. Okay. I'm not going to, I think the middle one is quite useful guidance. So in terms of the guidance that they're giving, they're saying that you have a DPI where it relates to your registered interest rather than just affecting it. So it's got to affect the interest that you have. So a really good example that they've given in that second bullet point is if you live at 1 Acacia Avenue, you will have a DPI if you apply for planning permission for 1 Acacia Avenue. But if your next door neighbour applies for planning permission, it won't be a DPI. Now, we've not been clear about that in the advice that we've been given, because there's been no guidance on that up until this point. So this will really help Steve and I and all the other lawyers give you a lot clearer advice, because we've had to advise you cautiously that it will be a DPI, whether it's your own property planning permission or your neighbours, because the law was not clear. But the fact that we've got government giving guidance on this point really, really helps us to give you a little bit clearer advice. So I think that's really, really positive. Okay, so moving on. So the examples of DPIs they give: awarding a contract to your own company. Clearly, we all know that's unacceptable. Taking part in a planning application for your own property. Taking part in a resident parking zone that includes your house. So all of these are so obvious that they would be things that, you shouldn't be taking any involvement in.
Can I just
Yes.
ask what a dispensation might be?
So basically, it's funny that you asked that, because before 2012, we granted dispensations all the time. And the reason for that was that we dealt with dispensations for towns and parishes. And what that involved was, now it involves an application to me for a dispensation so that you can take part in something that you've got an interest in. The reason why we used to do so many is really the places relevant are in small towns and parishes where they get a humongous development within the parish. So everybody on the parish council is impacted by it. So it would mean that nobody could take part in considering that planning application. So the dispensation enables them to take part. As you can imagine, at a district council where you've got much bigger numbers of members and much bigger committees, we very rarely get into that. So I've not granted a dispensation in 10 years. So, but yeah, really good question. But yeah, it's the very long-standing members who will remember that, but obviously those members that have come in since then won't, quite rightly. Okay, so now we're moving on to the other registrable interests. So this is the second type. So these are ones that relate to unpaid directorships, membership of outside bodies, charities, lobby groups, trade unions and political parties. So if you remember, when you fill in your declaration of interest form, it's those questions at the end. Have you been appointed onto a body by your council? Are you on a charitable body? Have you been, are you a member of a lobby group? A body influencing public opinion. So those questions at the end of the form will be your other registrable interest, basically. And as usual, you have to register those within 28 days. So ORIs are basically, as you've understood personal and prejudicial interest to be, in that you can still take part depending on the significance of it. So where a matter arises at a meeting which directly relates to the financial interest or well-being of an ORI, so an organisation that you're a member of, sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful, you need to disclose it, okay? You may speak on the matter only if members of the public, so if members of the public are allowed to speak, then you can speak on the matter. Sorry, I just reading that through because it didn't make sense to me for a second. Yeah, so if members of the public can't speak on it, you mustn't take part in any discussion unless you've got the dispensation, okay? So basically the ORIs, and that relates to membership of other bodies, okay? So examples that they've given is awarding or withdrawing grant funding or granting planning permission to a body of which you're a member. So, you know, community hall, if you were on the community hall, clearly it wouldn't be appropriate. Well, clearly you would have an interest in considering the awarding of any grant funding or granting planning permission because you will be on that body. Both directly relate both to the finances of that community hall, so that's why it's an interest. So you therefore need to disclose that, and you shouldn't participate in the discussion or vote and withdraw unless you have a dispensation or the public can address the meeting. They turned it slightly around the way that they do it now, but basically you can speak as long as the public can speak, but not if the public can't. So if it's a confidential item, then you can't speak at all. Okay. Now we move on to the NRIs. So think of the ORIs, the other registrable interest, as bodies that you're on, and the NRIs are about people that you've got connections with, so your friends and your relatives, okay? So where a matter arises at a meeting which directly relates to your financial interest or well-being and is not a DPI, or to a financial interest or well-being of a relative or close associate, you must disclose it. You can speak on the matter only if members of the public are also allowed to speak at the meeting, but otherwise you must not take part in it. So basically that's saying you can stay in the room and speak on it as long as you've declared it and as long as the public have the right to take part. So some examples they've given in the guidance: determining an application submitted by your sister or your neighbour for a dog breeding licence, a partner with a free parking permit, and you're making a policy review decision, or you object in a private capacity to your neighbour's planning application. So all of those would give rise to an NRI. So they go on to say that all three of those examples that I've given you directly relate to the finances of you, a partner, relative, or close associate. So it's all about the finances. All are therefore interests you should disclose, and you should not take part in any discussion, not vote, and not remain in the room unless the public can address the meeting. Okay. I just want to point out, I'm just going to go back to that slide, Steve. Yeah. If you see, they put non-registerable interest directly relates to. Now, at the beginning, I gave you the example of directly relates to is where the planning application relates to your own house. So it's your planning application. If it's not your planning application and it's your neighbour's, then it doesn't directly relate to your property, it affects it. So they've now separated out the NRIs to those that directly relate to, and then if we go back down, to those that affect you. Is everybody clear of that difference, or shall I explain it again? Because it's quite critical under this new code, and it is complicated. So this is about non-registerable interests that affect you. So they don't directly, so we'll give the house as an example. It's not an activity that's going on your own property. It's an activity that may be going on in next door or in your village that is going to affect your property. Same with your employment. It's not directly affecting the Tesco store that you work in, but maybe it indirectly affects it by something that's going to happen within the village that will have a knock-on effect on that Tesco store that you work on. Does everybody get that differentiation? Because I think that's quite important for understanding the difference between the two. Okay. So where it affects your financial interest or well-being or someone that you're connected to, so a friend or a family member, you have to disclose it, but you can remain in the meeting, participate and vote unless the matter affects the financial interest or well-being to a greater extent than it affects the financial interests of the majority of the inhabitants of the ward. So exactly the same as you've got at the moment. If it affects you more than the majority of your ward members, ward inhabitants, then that would give rise to an interest. But basically, if everybody is affected, then it doesn't give rise to an interest. And the second part of the test, and again, this is in your current code, a reasonable member of the public, knowing all the facts, would believe that it would affect your view of the wider public interest. So if you had a major development at the end of your road that, if you had a major development at the end of your sister's road, I think that a member of the public, knowing the facts, may well think that your judgment would be affected because your sister was close to a very major development. So it would probably tick that box. So this is all very familiar wording to you. It's just being slightly put under different terminology. So it would take a little bit of time to get used to. But what I will be able to let you have afterwards, which I found today, is the LGA's devised a really helpful flow chart. You can just ask your questions and then it takes you to things. So that will be really useful just for all members to have on their computer or, in their notebook or whatever, so that they can have a look at that. So if you've got a non-registerable interest, the consequences are you can speak on the matter only if members of the public are also allowed to speak at the meeting, otherwise you mustn't take part. So exactly the same as the interest that we talked about before. Okay. Examples of the NRIs that they're given: awarding grant funding to a competitor, to a community hall where you're on the membership committee, applying for housing development on land, dealing with an application for housing development on land near to your partner's business property, if your neighbour applies for planning permission, and it's because these examples affect the finances or well-being of someone that you're closely associated with. Okay. So, applying the test, you're over 65 and taking part in a discussion about provision for older people, you would be more affected than the majority by the outcome of the discussion. So clearly, we just talked about, would it affect you more? It's saying here that you would be more affected, so it would give rise to one of these interests. Okay, and you're discussing disclosure of the local authority-run care home where your father lives. So clearly, it's going to affect you more because your father lives there, so it would clearly give rise to an interest.
How did you get the age at 65 from? Sounds quite young for being elderly.
I don't know, they put that in the slide.
Only 5 years away from it.
Well, there you are, that's why you're worried about it then, isn't it?
Should be fair,
So on these interests, obviously we know it's not just financial, it's also well-being. So they've given some examples of well-being, because I think that's always a tricky one in terms of what affects my well-being. Roadworks, noise outside your house. If you're going to have roadworks going on for the next 6 months, that's clearly going to affect your well-being. Odours from a nearby tip, and antisocial behaviour from rough sleepers housed in B&Bs nearby. So whilst they're not financial issues, they can all affect your well-being and quality of life. So that's a test you need to apply when you're considering whether you've got an interest. Okay. I'll skip over interest as an executive member, as we haven't got any executive members in the room. Okay. So this is a summary, which I think is helpful. If something directly relates to your disclosable pecuniary interest, so that's your house, your employment, that type of thing, or it affects the financial interest or well-being of an other registered interest, or your financial interest or well-being, which is not a DPI, or the financial interest or well-being of a relative or close associate, you must disclose the interest, not participate in the discussion and leave the room. You can speak on the matter if you have a dispensation, and you can speak on the matter if members of the public are also allowed to speak at the matter, except if it relates to a DPI. So I think those two slides capture it in a nutshell. If it's a DPI, you can never speak. If it's one of the others, you can speak as long as the public have the same right to speak before you leave the room. Okay. And if something affects, so that was directly relating to, if something affects your financial interest or well-being, or the financial interest or well-being of a relative or close associate, or the financial interest or well-being of an ORI, so one of those organisations that you're on, you must disclose the interest. You can stay, speak and vote unless they are affected to a greater extent than most people, and people would think your judgment might be clouded. If so, you mustn't participate in any discussion and you should leave the room. Any questions on that? I appreciate it's a lot to take in the first time you're being exposed to it. It's even a lot for me to take in because I'm obviously getting used to a new code as well, having done the same, really had the same code for the last 10 years. You know, you have to go through those examples and come up with scenarios. So, you know, it will get easier over a period of time. So just to conclude, have I managed to do that in an hour? Less than an hour.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
pleased with that. I'm really pleased with that.
Don't slow down.
I'm not going to.
Don't spoil it in the
42 minutes and 30 seconds.
So basically the report is setting out two options. It could have given you more options, to be fair. What it's saying is I think the two options are that you adopt the LGA code with the recommended changes. And the reason I say with the recommended changes is because I feel that those additions are quite critical and shouldn't be left out. Or you could remain with the current code, but we would have to update it if we were going to do that. And then we would obviously potentially be the only council in Somerset with that code. And that, I think, would be a negative step in terms of the preparation for transition from the 4 authorities to 5 authorities to the 1. So the recommendation is that you adopt the LGA code with recommended changes. The actual recommendations I've set out there for you, but effectively it's to recommend adoption to council, for the revised code to go into the council's constitution, for me to develop some training, which this would form a basis, and promote that training to members so that members take that up. For us to continue to promote adoption of this code to towns and parishes, and I have seen that a lot are doing that. Be interested to know whether those of you who are on towns and parishes, whether yours are doing that. And finally, for me, in consultation with the chair and the independent persons, to make appropriate amendments to our complaints procedures. They're not significant amendments, they're just to make sure that we obviously comply with the latest guidance that has been issued by the LGA. So that basically is the report. Happy to answer any questions on any of that or go through anything if I've not been clear.
Are there any questions, members?
Nothing of great importance, I don't think. I just spotted at one stage there was one of the items there that does not refer to parish town councils.
Right, okay.
But apart from that disclaimer there,
Yeah.
all this will go forward to
Yeah.
Cheddar,
Yeah.
Hypers, Burnham, whatever. And they will have to accept it again, or if that's it.
No, so all of the towns and parishes have already been written to. They were written to in April and recommended to adopt it with a joint letter from all of the councils and SELC. So most of them have, well, not most, I can't say how many, but a lot of them have considered that and I know have been adopting it. So what I would do now is I would continue to encourage them, and in September, and the reason I want to encourage them is in September, ideally, I'd like to do one training, not one session, but on one code, not multiple codes. I don't want to have to do one on the South Code, the old Sedgemoor Code, and the LGA Code. So I'm going to continue trying to promote this code, if we go with it, to all of the towns and parishes. But I know a number of them have adopted it because they've been coming to me and asking questions. So fingers crossed. I don't know anybody's experience, if they know what's happening on their own parishes.
Well, a couple of parishes that I've attended, they are adopting it.
Brilliant.
But have you got a list of all the parishes and the ones that are adopting it and not adopting it?
No. And that's what I need to write out, and I've now got to ask them to all give me that information. So that's the difficulty, because they've not necessarily told me. So I need their codes to put on our website, so I need to write out to them all and ask them to let me know. So that is information I don't hold yet, but I need to hold it in time for the September training.
So what about, so just playing devil's advocate, if we all agree that we want to adopt the LGA code, and the majority of the parish councils, or the town councils, but the few that don't, they can adopt the other code, then, can they?
Yeah, they could just stay with what they've already got. So absolutely, they can do that. It's an option for every council. As long as you adopt a code, it doesn't matter which code you adopt, as long as it includes certain things. So, but obviously from them, I think it's the dual-hatted members who really need to lobby, because it's really helpful if you're a dual or triple-hatted member that you're complying with the same code wherever you're going. And I think it's helpful for the public, because the first question I get from the public is, which code is it they've adopted? Which one do I need to look at? Whereas if we just had one model code, that would be so much easier for the public as well. So I think we can only continue to raise awareness and encourage. So, if you have the ability when you're going to your towns and parish meetings, and you have the ability to encourage them to adopt it, please do, and I will continue to do the same as well. But we may end up with a situation, but I suppose I'll have to make a judgment then. If I've got one or two that are using one code, I'll have to make a judgment on whether I'm going to give them training or not, or whether I just leave Self to do that. But whether Self will do that, I don't know. But we'll have to look at that. It depends what the take up is, really. How many people need training on the codes.
Just got another quick question from Councillor Diego Rodriguez, who's attending virtually because he's got COVID. Is there a legal requirement for members to take part in refresher training? Asking, as I think it's important, all members are briefed on social media.
So there is the new obligation in the code to comply, to undertake code of conduct training. It doesn't say refresher training, so no, it doesn't say that. It's just about code of conduct training. So no, it's not in there at the moment. And the trouble is, we could add it, but then we make the code different for the other, we're different to the other councils. So I'm a bit nervous about us departing and having different things in there. But ultimately, it is a matter for yourselves.
Are there any more questions then, members? Jot that down and pay attention. So we can
I'm
go
looking
into
at
the,
tractors.
so we can go into the recommendation then.
Yes, please.
Can I have a proposal and seconder for the recommendations? Councillor Matthews. All those in favour, please show.
All right.
That's unanimous, Jim.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Wellman. That's very good.
Yes, it was.
I now declare this meeting closed.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think that will come before you on the 20th of July, Council.
You'll have to do that because
Which one?
20th of July.
I'm in Corfu.